The third reason we have concocted and clung so desperately to this mythology of the Civil War is perhaps the most unsettling to hear because it involves examining what the Confederates actually did as opposed to just screaming the word traitors over and over again. I mean, heaven forbid we actually take a look at their actions within the context of the American story, which is the topic of this evening's seminar. So, what did these so-called traitors do? Well, let's start with what they didn't do. Well, they didn't exactly sell nuclear secrets to the Chinese. South Carolina, the first state to secede, did not enter into an agreement to restore the British Empire's claim to the southern states, nor did Louisiana make any real effort to bring the French back. Texas did not join with Mexico. So, for starters, we throw this term traitor around far too cheaply. Frankly, I reject the notion that that is the proper term for the Southern Confederates. They did not betray this country or sell it out to a foreign power, so what did they do? Well, the state legislatures of the 11 Confederate states assembled together, deliberated, and voted to leave the Union and form their own nation. Oh boy, where have we heard this story before? Yes, all 11 Confederate states practiced slavery when they declared their independence, as did all 13 colonies when they seceded from Britain. Or do I have that language switched? You see how it's just a game of semantic favoritism. There was no legal precedent or stipulation that said the Confederate states could not secede from the Union, and the only means of compelling them to remain in the Union was by force. The Founding Fathers were loyal subjects to the Crown, and thus had far less legal ground to stand on than the Confederates did. Therefore, why wouldn't the Confederates believe they had the right to leave and form their own country? People expressed shock and dismay by the Southerners' decision to secede, as though it was an unfathomable and indefensible course of action. And yet the very first words of our Declaration of Independence say, when, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, followed shortly after by, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form, as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. The Southern states simply borrowed the playbook of our own Founding Fathers, and so the Southern Confederacy was forced against its will to rejoin the Union by sheer strength of arms, just as the colonies were attacked by the British Crown, except this time the Union was successful where the British were not. And so the nation founded by armed rebellion in the name of self-determination forcibly denied and suppressed the same type of effort by its own citizens within 100 years of its own creation, despite having zero legal grounds to do so. Perhaps now you can see our eternal problem. America is a nation founded on a false premise. We are a nation defined by treasonous rebellion that cannot tolerate its own treasonous rebels. There are a lot of people these days saying that this country does not celebrate traitors. Yes, we do. Every day. They're on our money. We've named countless cities, buildings, and schools after them. We've erected monuments to them, praising them for taking the side of treason. But then we somehow simultaneously forsake those who came afterwards and attempted to do the same thing, but not to ultimate success. None of this is to embrace or condemn either the Founding Fathers or the Southern Confederacy. In no way, shape, or form am I attempting to do either. I am just declaring what nobody else wishes to state anymore, that our nation's history and heritage are ultimately defined by hypocrisy. At our very core, we are a hypocritical nation. How else could we erect monuments to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, both of whom were Southern slave owners who committed treason against their country in the name of rebellion, and then also erect a monument to Abraham Lincoln, a man who quelled rebellion by force, and all within 3 miles of each other? If King George III is truly a tyrant, how on earth is Lincoln not as well? The Union became what it had originally sought to avoid and oppose, and there's a massive life lesson leering back at us in that we might one day become just like our opponents of yesterday. People look at the firing on Fort Sumter as though it's a preposterous action, yet we praise a bunch of rabble-rousers for dressing up like Native Americans and throwing tea into the Boston Harbor. We are incapable of entertaining the possibility that the Southern Confederacy might have had a legitimate right to leave the Union over issues of tariffs and the mobilization of troops. but we take as gospel and revere the actions of the founding fathers who did the exact same thing over taxes and the quartering of troops. This is a country that lionizes men who took up arms and committed acts of physical violence against tax collectors, and now it puts people in jail for failure to pay taxes. Do not misunderstand me. I have tremendous respect for our founding fathers, but in hindsight, perhaps they should have considered the possibility that armed rebellion and treason against your current country is a tricky way to form a new country, because you run the risk that your own people might do it to you down the road. And so, it's the height of absurdity to be aghast at the Southern Confederacy and gawk in horror with some sort of forced moral outrage that they had the gall to replicate what our own founders did. Further, I find it disingenuous to smugly assert that neither of us would have done something similar if we were presented with such an opportunity and in the same circumstances. We can't even begin to imagine the difficult position Americans found themselves in when their home states left the Union to form a new country, and they had to choose between two sides with no clear legal directives, families torn apart by allegiances, and not sure who would prevail in the end. I mean, if the federal government sued your family, your spouse even, would you automatically side with the federal government over your own family? I think the universe merely collected a karmic debt from this nation when it was forced to pay the price for creating itself in such a manner by beating back its very own rebellion. Is there not some interesting truth to be reflected upon when we observe that the very act that made this country nearly unmade it too? And what are we to make of the Confederate States, their leaders, and their citizens? After all, we forced them to rejoin the Union and to become citizens of our nation once more. So why are we forsaking them, implicitly casting them into historical hellfire for eternity? North Carolina was North Carolina as a colony, a state in the Union, then a state in the Confederacy, and is again back in the Union. If we are canceling and disowning the Southern Confederacy, why did we fight to keep those states and their citizens, but also their leadership? I could rattle off a whole list of Confederate leaders who served in elected positions in the U.S. government and even the U.S. Army before and after the Civil War. These attempts to condemn the Confederacy in absolute terms are a direct rejection of President Lincoln's aims for reconciliation and everything the Union Army fought for. You see, this country has become that arrogant and intoxicated person at the party of the world, the one who can throw out insults at everyone else, but as soon as one person comes along and claps back, we crumble and call it unfair. We all know somebody like this, and if we don't, it's because we're that person. It's okay when we declare independence on our terms and we win, but as soon as someone else does it to us, it's completely unacceptable. And now it's the virtuous thing to suppress rebellion because it suddenly suits our interests at that particular moment. I mean, if you want to, you can look up correspondence and conversations between Union diplomats and ambassadors and their British counterparts. The British laughed at the Union's disgust with the Southern Rebellion, finding it the height of hypocrisy, pointing out how the former colonies were following in the British Crown's own footsteps by rejecting the Confederacy's rebellion through strength of arms. And if we truly were a nation interested in telling the truth, the sort of nation that makes its citizens swear in a court of law to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God, then we would include some of this correspondence in our history textbooks to maybe open our eyes to the complexity of human affairs and the potential for all of us to contradict ourselves or find ourselves on both sides of a particular issue. But you won't find a morsel of self-awareness in the pages of this selective drivel being spoon-fed to our children nationwide. It is a very unsettling thing, but the truth often is unsettling. We are a nation devoid of any self-awareness, and that is why we have insisted on perpetrating this myth that the Civil War was all about slavery. Because we can swallow this colossal bit of hypocrisy, of complete and total self-contradiction in our very own story, if we can somehow make the Civil War be about a moral cause like slavery. It goes down easier if you just say, yes, but those guys were the bad guys, so it's okay. You can overlook and ignore and, dare I say, even celebrate and praise what is a horrific inconsistency in the founding and preservation of this country if we unfairly demonize the losers and unfairly praise the victors of the Civil War. And we have done exactly that by conjuring up a lofty cause. Because otherwise, we do live in a world where might makes right, where if you can win, you have the moral mandate and high ground. And given the successes, some temporal and others more lasting, that some regimes have had over the years, like, say, the Mongols, the Huns, the Bolsheviks, the Third Reich, and so on, We should feel very, very reluctant to adopt this viewpoint that success proves morality, because then things get real dicey, real fast. Please understand that I mean these words with the utmost earnestness. I do not hold it against anyone who opts to ignore all of these inconvenient truths, who chooses to look away from the catastrophic fraudulence of this country's origins, and continues to believe the slavery-only myth as a justification for the Civil War and the elimination of a state's right to secede in a nation defined by rebellion. It is easier and more comfortable. But there is a price to pay for that comfort, and it is the gradual erosion of our collective intellect and self-awareness. I don't find it shocking at all that we have morphed into a bloated and bumbling superstate that inserts itself into everyone else's affairs, often to great suffering by others, while we completely neglect to tend to matters at home and completely ignorant about our own history. A people constantly assaulting the splinter in our neighbor's eyes, but utterly clueless about the one in ours. That is not to say that we haven't been a great nation or that we can't become one again, but a nation that believes itself to have always been right, and that tolerates its own blatant self-contradictions by manufacturing false myths will almost always degenerate into a self-righteous hypocrisy. It is what the decline of empires is made of. See, until we Americans begin to grapple with our own self-contradictions and the complexity of our own affairs without fabricating false moral causes to justify our actions, I don't think this country is going to be a serious country, certainly not a country that others take seriously. We will continue to lick invisible wounds, wave countless bloody shirts in perpetuity, smearing the legacies of the deceased who cannot defend themselves, and then claim some sort of moral victory. The sort of country that scores own goals on itself and thinks it's winning. I promised my students I'd use a sports metaphor, so there you go. Listen, I don't blame you for believing the comic book, the fairy tale that the Confederates were demons in gray uniforms, that the saintly Abraham Lincoln slew the big bad Jefferson Davis, and that all was right again in the realm, that the victors can never be wrong and the losers can never be right. It makes it easier to sleep at night. We all have the right to be wrong. It's a right I assure you I have taken advantage of myself plenty of times, and I'm sure I will again. And so, if you are one who likes the direction this country seems to be heading, a nation that is constantly at odds with its own history, a country that imagines ghosts and is plagued by self-loathing, a nation of silly people who invent their own truths and wage wars on dead people, of iconoclastic zealotry that cannot allow for objective self-analysis without the knee-jerk assertion of some sort of race-based dogma, then by all means let's continue on the road we're headed. And I'm sure most of you can tell by my words this evening that I am very much against the recent flare-up of self-righteous angst that has led to the undemocratic removal of so many statues and icons. But I must state quite clearly that the most extreme of those partisans are at least ideologically consistent. We cannot cancel Robert E. Lee without also canceling Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. We cannot praise Lincoln and Grant while also condemning the British Crown. We cannot forsake the Confederacy and also revere the Continental Congress. We cannot applaud Sherman's March to the Sea and also celebrate the 4th of July. And so, as opposed as I am to all of these childish outbursts masquerading as heroism, the ones who clamor to remove all of the statues and monuments and rename all of the schools are at least ideologically consistent. If you want to start removing some, very soon you're going to have to remove them all. But I suspect there may be some of you here this evening who are open to this conversation, who are open to understanding the hard truth. And to those of you, I say, welcome to the club. Unfortunately, it's not a very big one. I know we're going to hear from my colleagues on this stage here shortly, but I wanted to close my opening remarks with a more contemporary reference. It may seem a bit out of place, but I found it so poignant and universally applicable that I could not resist reading it tonight. A good academic always discloses his sources, and so I'd like to read one of the final excerpts from the TV show Chernobyl. We're on dangerous ground right now because of our secrets and our lies. They are practically what defines us. When the truth offends, we lie and lie until we cannot even remember it's there, but it is still there. Every lie we tell incurs a debt to the truth. Sooner or later, the debt is paid. Given the severely divided state of our country, I doubt I need to tell you what price we will pay for failing to grapple with the truth about the Civil War, and for our intentional suppression of the truths that we found inconvenient. Just like the national deficit, the intellectual debt we keep accruing to the truth will come due. I am not in the conversion business. I am not peddling a course or a book. This is not a personal crusade for me. I am well aware that all empires collapse eventually, and I am not arrogant enough to think that it is my job to save this country. Either the country will save itself or it won't. I just came to tell the truth, because it's about damn time someone did. I only ask that some of you join me in doing the same. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button and subscribe. Seriously. It will help the algorithm spread the message. Thank you.